So today we're going to cover chapter 4. I'm going to pray and we're going to review chapter 3 and then we'll jump right in. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we do thank you for this day. God, we thank you for the rain. God, we know it is a provision from you. God, we thank you for the breath that fills our lungs and the health that we have that allows us to be here. God, you are the giver of all good gifts. And so we praise you. Father, I want to thank you for this time with my sisters over Zoom to cover this last chapter of the book of Ruth. Father, I pray that you would, by your Spirit, enable me to lead us well through this last chapter. God, I pray that you would help me to communicate well the beautiful truths that we can find in this last chapter of the book of Ruth. And Father, I pray for my sisters that they would be encouraged and built up, Lord, and if need be, Father, would you convict them? God, would you transform all of our thinking, Father, even as you used these reminders afresh this morning with me, just to renew my thinking about you and your providences. God, I pray that if that's necessary in my sisters' lives, that you would do it for them as well. God, we just lift this time up to you. We know that without you, we can do nothing. And so we offer this time up to you and ask that you would do so much more with it, Father, than we could even imagine. And we pray these things all in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so today we are going to look at chapter 4. Last week we covered chapter 3. And if you remember, last week we called it chapter 3, a decent proposal. So in the decent proposal, we saw Ruth actually proposing marriage to Boaz on the heels of a set of unusual circumstances. We saw Naomi's concern being shifted from herself to her daughter-in-law and wanting to make a way for her daughter-in-law to be cared for. We saw Ruth showing submission again to Naomi's plan, except with a slight deviation from the plan where she didn't wait for Boaz to tell her what to do, but she actually asks him to marry her. We saw Boaz's worthiness as he protected Ruth's honor there on the threshing floor, and then also as he acknowledged this nearer redeemer who would have to be checked with before they could go forward with their plans for marriage. We see Ruth carrying home 80 pounds of grain on her back as a sort of pledge or promise potentially to Naomi for what Boaz would do that day. And then chapter 3 wound up with Naomi telling Ruth to wait. Now they only need wait because the man would solve or settle the matter that very day. So that's where we left off last week, sort of a cliffhanger of sorts. And so now we pick back up the story, and today we'll see the resolution of the story, and this will be our last day of study. I often get sad when I come to the end of one of these studies, for a number of reasons. One, it's such an encouragement to me just to dive deep into God's word in order to prepare to study, but also just seeing you all every week is also very encouraging. So hopefully maybe soon, maybe in the fall, I'm gonna look at doing another Zoom lesson. These have worked out really well and been, I think, encouraging and easy for especially moms to be a part of. So keep your eye out for that. So we named the chapters, or I named the chapters as we went through them. If you remember, chapter 1 was a chapter of choices. We saw Elimelech's choice, Naomi's choice, and then Ruth's, also Orpha's choice. Then chapter 2 we called divine coincidences. So it was a chapter that had a lot of divine, what we would call coincidences. Chapter 3 was called a decent proposal. And chapter 4 I named divine providence. So we see a lot of we see the revelation of a lot of God's divine providence in the lives of these two ladies and Boaz's life, but also really eventually in our own lives as we are the beneficiaries ultimately of the work that God did in the lives of these two ladies. So I'm going to read through the book. I almost forgot to read, not the whole book, sorry, y'all. I'm going to read the chapter. I almost forgot to read the chapter. So we're going to read the chapter together. So open your Bible to Ruth Chapter 4. And then I want you to, if you have a ribbon in your Bible, or you can stick a finger in Matthew Chapter 1. And we're going to, as soon as we finish reading Chapter 4, we're going to cut over to Matthew Chapter 1 and read verses 6b through 16. So this is the word of the Lord, ladies. Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. And now turn to Matthew. Matthew 1, 6b. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzzah, and Uzzah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So I don't know about y'all, but I can't read the genealogy in Matthew without singing that little song by Andrew Peterson. I don't know, that song always gets in my head and then it gets stuck. But I wanted to take us all the way down in the genealogy to the birth of Jesus, because it's not enough for us, from our perspective, really, is it, to end with Obed father Jesse and Jesse father David, right? For our purposes, we want to see the bigger picture as well as the smaller picture of what's actually happening here in the 4th chapter, or the final chapter of the book of Ruth. So now we'll just walk through like we have been, verse by verse. In verses 1 and 2, we see now that Boaz goes. So as Naomi predicted at the end of chapter 3, Boaz lost no time starting the process to try to settle this matter of who the Redeemer would be. And we see this as a part of his worthiness, right? So he was going to make sure that day that these women were cared for, whether they would be cared for by the nearer Redeemer or whether they would be cared for by him. He was going to settle that matter. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, we see Ruth going to try to provide for Naomi and for herself. We see her going, but now we see that it's Boaz that goes. He is now in charge, and the women are simply waiting the outcome of his efforts. And just as I was reading through my notes again this morning, I was just struck by how there's just a source of like deep comfort there, of Boaz going for Ruth and for Naomi. They're not having to fend for themselves, but they have a worthy man now caring for them. And whether it's a good father or a good husband or a good boss or even a good pastor, as women, as we allow these worthy and good men to care for us, we should allow them to care for us. There's a deep comfort there, and there's a deep blessing there for us, I think, as we allow the worthy men that God has placed in our lives to actually care for us. I know this can be a loaded statement, just because not always are the men that are in our lives worthy of our trust, but I think we could all identify men in our lives who are worthy of our trust and worthy of allowing to care for us. So Boaz goes and he sits at the gate of the city ready to do business. So there's 2 reasons why he went to the gate of the city. The first one is it's the busiest place in the morning. So the gate of the city, many people would be going in and out of the gate. They would be going out to work in the fields. They would be going out to work in other cities. So there'd be a great, it's kind of like the freeways in the mornings here, right? They're very busy with people getting after whatever their job is that day. The gate also served as the sort of courthouse for the day. So it was the place where legal transactions took place. So if you remember in Proverbs 31, the excellent wife, or the worthy wife, her husband sits at the gate with the elders of the city. It's a place of honor, but it's a place where legal transactions would take place. And behold, again, we see this word, this behold word, like as it would happen or by chance, the near Redeemer happened to come by. Just so happened that the near Redeemer came by. And Boaz calls him over and asks him to sit down. This must not have been, so there's a lot of things that the narrator of this book, all throughout the book really, just sort of says, and he just expects that we will understand it because the people in the story understand it. So this nearer Redeemer just comes and sits, he's called over to sit down. He doesn't say, hey, I'm too busy, I'm on my way to wherever. He just goes and sits down. So this must have been, in their culture, a normal thing. Boaz did not call the man by name, though surely he would have known his name. Instead, the narrator relates that he called him Mr. So-and-so. So it's translated friend in the ESV, but it's a sort of rhyming word in the original language that communicates a Mr. So-and-so. So that guy or Mr. So-and-so, his name is completely omitted, even though Boaz certainly would have known his name, and the writer or narrator of the book would likely have known his name. Why is this? Why is it that we get a lot of names in the book, but we don't get this guy's name? Why is that? Well, the commentators agree it's likely a literary device to omit his name because he doesn't fulfill his redemption obligation. So he doesn't, even though he is a nearer Redeemer, he opts, as we've already seen, not to take that role. And so because he doesn't, the narrator opts to not include his name in the story. Like Orpah in chapter 1, he does the ordinary and expected thing, not the hesed thing. And with his decision, he disappears into obscurity, just like Orpah does. So we never hear again about Orpah. We never hear again about Mr. So-and-so. So Mr. So-and-so comes over and sits down, and then Boaz convenes a legal quorum of 10 elders from the city for the proceedings. So this is legal language. 10 was the legal number. He probably picked them out of the crowd as they passed by, and they probably only represented a portion of the elders of the city. So there's probably more than 10 elders, but he only needed 10 for what he was about to do, for the legal proceedings. In the same way that we have 12 jury members, he needed 10 for this. This is probably included in the story. These details are probably included so that there would be no question later on that the outcome of the proceedings was legal. So sort of in the same way when Jesus went to the tomb of Lazarus, the number of days that he'd been in the tomb is repeated because that was considered in the tradition to be the time when the spirit had actually left the body. So what they're saying there by repeating the number of days that Lazarus had been in the tomb was that he was dead, right? So there would be no question later on about whether or not Lazarus was really dead. Okay, so then in verses 3 through 6, we see Boaz's clever plan. So since he had gathered the necessary number of elders, he began the proceedings. And interestingly, and probably strategically, he begins with land and not with Ruth. He begins telling Mr. So-and-so about land that Naomi has that she wants to sell, but he doesn't lead out with Ruth. So there's this land, and they are the only two relatives that are eligible to redeem it, Mr. So-and-so first. Mr. So-and-so and Boaz are probably cousins. The land is interesting because it's the first mention of it that we have in the entire story. Like, I didn't know that, until we read this, I didn't know that Naomi owned anything. It sounded like she was destitute. the way that the reading of the story goes. But evidently there was land that had belonged to Elimelech, and land was to be handed down perpetually within a family. So there was land to be redeemed. After Boaz presents him with this, Mr. So-and-so responds. For him, at this point anyway, before the introduction of Ruth into the equation, for Mr. So-and-so, this would have been a shrewd investment. It would have been shrewd because for very little money, he gets a presumably productive field with no risk of an heir showing up later to reclaim it. So all he knows right now is there's an old widow and a piece of land, and he has first dibs on it. Well, that sounds pretty good because I don't have to marry her because she's old. She's not going to produce an heir. I'm not going to be expected to try to produce an heir through her to perpetuate Elimelech's name. So I get the land, the production of the land, and no heir to show up later. It becomes mine and I can pass it down. And then, of course, he would have to take care of Naomi, but how much could that be? So just to take care of one little old lady, the gains would definitely outweigh the losses in Mr. So-and-so's mind. So he agrees to buy it, and then Boaz turns his consent into a condition. So it's now that Boaz introduces, after Mr. So-and-so has already said yes, that Boaz introduces Ruth. He reveals that the purchase comes with strings attached. So in Mr. So-and-so's mind, it was no strings attached, but now Boaz reveals that there actually are strings attached. He would also acquire Ruth the Moabite to perpetuate the name of the dead in their inheritance. So she would be included in the bargain. So if Mr. So-and-so bought the land, he would also have to take Ruth in order for her to produce an heir. So Elimelech's name and her husband's name, which we find out later is Mahlon, their name would go on. That they would have name and land were big deals in this society. And so that the name would be perpetuated and that the land would stay in the family. So once Mr. So-and-so hears that, all of a sudden, all bets are off, right? So that's what he says in verse 6. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So this is verse 6. Well, what does he mean? He's backing out, right? He doesn't want to be in this agreement now. He cannot rather than he will not. He's saying, I cannot, not that he will not. Well, why couldn't he? Well, he didn't want to impair his inheritance. So if he took Ruth, that means he would marry her and he would be bound to try to produce for her an offspring. So if she bore a child to him, that child would eventually have legal rights to the land, Elimelech's land, at no cost. So that would be a loss to him. So he's buying the land, redeeming the land, but then later, if there were offspring, when they grew up, it would be theirs at no cost. So that would be a loss to him. The feeding and care for not only Naomi, but also Ruth and a child and potentially children. So he has no way of knowing how fertile Ruth will be. She's young, right? She has the ability to produce offspring, although she hasn't. And, we know that Ruth had Obed, but we don't know if there were other offspring. There likely were. So that would also that would further drain his wealth. So it's looking less and less like a great deal for him. Also, the child would have legal rights as well to Mr. So-and-so's estate, diminishing what his current children received at their death. So it spreads everything a little thinner. If he marries Ruth, she has a child or children. So it spreads everything a little thinner. And so this is why the commentators think he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So he is worried about his own inheritance. He's not worried about caring for the two widows who he's first in line to care for. And so he's Mr. So-and-so. And so this is the last we hear of him. And we all breathe a sigh of relief. Because this is what we wanted to happen, right? So when we reached the cliffhanger at the end of last week, I was at least, like, every time I read it, there's a little bit of tension, isn't there, in the story? What will happen? Will Boaz and Ruth ever be together? And now we've got this guy who's in the way. Well, now he's not in the way anymore. Praise the Lord. In verses 7 through 12, we see a ceremony and a blessing. To ratify the transfer of the right of redemption to Boaz, Mr. So-and-so removes his sandal and hands it to Boaz. So the narrator says this was the custom of the day. And we saw a little bit of that, didn't we, last week, where there was a taking off, I think there was a spitting on and a taking off of a sandal for someone who wouldn't perpetuate the inheritance of a dead relative. And so this sort of mirrors that a little bit, but it's different. Anyway, whatever it was, again, the narrator assumes that the readers will know about this custom, at least have heard of it. Mr. So-and-so takes his sandal off and hands it to Boaz. And this was how the transaction is ratified. And Mr. So-and-so exits, never to be heard of again, with one sandal. And our hero Boaz stands there holding his other sandal. So then Boaz turns and addresses the 10 elders and the crowd that had surely gathered. So we can imagine, right? So you can imagine, it's a small town. People are going in and out of the gate. They see that court has convened, right? They're probably gathering, probably not a lot going on in those days of interest. So a lot of people had gathered. And now Boaz turns and formally addresses the crowd. He says, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people who had gathered, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. It seems like maybe there was even something more than the land, because he says all that belonged to Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion. So there may have been other property. We don't know. There is land. There may have been other items that were transferred. But then there's Ruth. And it is interesting. He announces that he has acquired her, Mahlon's widow, to become his wife. So we finally figure out which son Ruth was married to, because this is the first time we find out. It doesn't say at the beginning of the book. So she was married to Mahlon. In verse 10, this is interesting. So in verse 10, see that first word there that's translated also? It carries with it in the original language an emphatic force. An emphatic force. So Hubbard, which is one of the, Robert L. Hubbard is one of the commentaries I read, says that it really ought to be translated and more importantly. It shouldn't be just merely translated also. And I like that because just also sounds like he's just listing Ruth off in a list of land, property, items, whatever. But if it carries with it the force that the commentator says it does and should be translated, and more importantly, I love that. So even more important than the land and whatever other items may have been left, the most important thing to Boaz is that he had acquired Ruth to be his wife. I love that. And he proclaims the purpose. He would receive nothing from the purchase of the land, right? Because now, remember one of the reasons the nearer redeemer refused it was because he didn't want his inheritance to be impaired. But Boaz is fine with that because all he wants is his woman. He wants Ruth. And so he's okay if there's an offspring and that offspring grows up to inherit the land. He's fine with that. His goal is Hesed. His goal is to care for Ruth and for Naomi. Boaz completes the transaction with a hearty repetition of the earlier charge to the elders and the crowds. You are witnesses today. He did indeed settle the matter just as Naomi said he would today. He settled it. It's settled. And the crowd replies with the affirmative, we are witnesses, followed by a 3-part blessing. So we're going to walk through this blessing because it's important. So beginning in, verse 11, we see this 3-part blessing. First, that the Lord would bless Ruth like he did Rachel and Leah, the founding mother of Israel. Founding mothers, Rachel and Leah of Israel. In other words, that the Lord would bless her fertility and grant them many and distinguished children. So they're asking that the Lord would give her, and remember, I don't know when I said this, maybe it was maybe it was the first day, but all the prayers in the book of Ruth are answered eventually, which is very remarkable. So when they pray that God would bless Ruth like he did Rachel and Leah, the founding mothers of Israel, and that God would grant her fertility and many and distinguished children, we can say that that prayer was answered. First of all, it was answered in King David, right? So Obed is the ancestor of King David. But then the greater son, right? So David's greater son, who is Christ. So that prayer is answered. Then the crowd wishes Boaz renown in his hometown of Bethlehem. They pray that he will be renowned in his hometown. And finally, they wish that his house would be built up, or pray that his house will be built up like that of Perez. So in effect, they are wishing that the Lord would make Boaz's family line prominent, and the Lord did that. Notice here the shift from Elimelech's family line as the benefactor of Ruth's fertility to Boaz's family line being the one that gains the prominence in Judah. So with the marriage, the prominence, right? The family name stays, but the prominence is shifted to Boaz's family line. This threefold blessing is seen by some commentators as the culmination of Ruth's assimilation into Israel. So we talked last time about how Ruth was continuing to be assimilated into Israel as her worth is known and as her deeds are known. She begins to see herself more as a part of the community, and the community begins to see her. If you'll remember, Boaz says, for all the townspeople know that you are a worthy woman. So throughout the book, we see her being assimilated into the community. And this with this marriage is that her final assimilation into the community. The crowd recognizes that it is the Lord who will give Boaz and Ruth children. So if you look at the end of verse 12, the townspeople say, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. So the townspeople acknowledge that it is the Lord who opens or closes the womb. And so just a few thoughts on fertility and the lack thereof. So it is wrong to assume that Ruth was the one in her first marriage who was infertile. So I think we have this idea when there's infertility in a couple that it's always the woman's fault. I don't know where that comes from, but it's not based on science. Scientifically, when there is infertility, a third of the time it's the woman, a third of the time it's the man, and the third of the time it's unknown from unknown reasons. Clearly, Ruth was not infertile once she married Boaz. Now, she was married for a while to her first husband, and no children were produced. But when she married Boaz, the Lord opened her womb. Either way, the Lord is the giver of life. It is also wrong to assume that withholding of children is a punishment for some sin. So some commentators say that children were withheld from Mahlon and Ruth, or Chilion and Orpah, because they should not have married Moabite women. But I think it is wrong to assume that the withholding of children is punishment for some sin. Now, it is the result of sin, right? We live in a fallen world, right? And there may be some personal sin, but we should never assume that that's the reason why the Lord is withholding. All of us have sinned enough today to send us right to hell. All of us have sinned enough this morning to send us right to hell. And whether in the withholding or the giving of all good gifts, the Lord is working for the good of his children. So we see the good of the Lord withholding children from Ruth and Moab. Ruth may have never left to come to Bethlehem if there had been children in Moab. Naomi may have never left to come back to Bethlehem if there had been children, grandchildren in Moab. So we see that the Lord is working through the withholding of this good gift for the good of his children. And just so some other thoughts about fertility. Children are just as important to married couples today, and infertility can be just as devastating. So important for different reasons. I don't think a lot of people today have children thinking that those children will care for them later in life. We have things like 401ks and savings accounts and Social Security, though I don't know how secure that is anymore. So we have these things, right, that we can look forward to depending on. Whereas in Ruth and Boaz's day, children were the means of support. But infertility is just as devastating on married couples today. And I was just going to say, if someone you know, or if you are struggling with infertility, I'd be happy to help in any way that I can. That's been part of our story. And something we've walked through with a lot of friends. And so if there's any way that I could help, I would be honored to. Okay, so then in verses 13 through 17, we have a radical reversal of fortune. So rather quickly, the narrator moves the story forward. Ruth and Boaz marry, and the Lord gives conception, and a son is born. So we fast forward through 10, 12 months in just a few sentences. That the Lord gives life, that it is the Lord that gives life, is affirmed again in verse 13. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. The women, probably some of the same who greeted Naomi upon her return, you remember them, right? When Naomi returned, those women that were like, oh, is this Naomi? So probably some of those same women, we're not talking that long ago, right? So we're talking maybe a year ago now at this point, because we only got through one harvest season. So maybe we're just talking a year or a little bit more that they've been back. Probably some of these same women who greeted Naomi upon her return to Bethlehem now welcome her newborn heir. Now welcome her. And that must have been encouraging for them too, mustn't it? To see the reversal of fortune for Naomi. They acknowledge that it is the Lord who has provided this baby as a redeemer for Naomi. That's kind of crazy too, isn't it? Ruth does all the hard work, but Naomi's the one that gets the redeemer, right? And so this is how this works with this firstborn son. They pray for him also that he would be a person of renown, just like they prayed for Boaz, his father, that he would be a person of renown in Israel. And this actually surpasses the blessing, because if you'll remember, Boaz got the blessing. They prayed for Boaz to be renowned in Bethlehem, which was the town, but they pray for the whole country, that Boaz would get renowned in the whole country. So it surpasses even the first blessing. And then, it also anticipates the upcoming genealogy, right? It anticipates the upcoming genealogy. The term restorer of life probably refers to the fact that because of Obed, the family name no longer faces extinction. So the restorer of the life of the family, he would now be that. The family name would not die as it potentially could have with the deaths of Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. Obed would carry on the family name. And the nourisher of your old age refers to him providing for her and caring for her in her final years. So she's going to care for him while he's a baby. And then as the nourisher in her old age, then he would care for her when she's older in her final years. The women go on to note that the reason for Naomi's blessings is because of Ruth. Do you see it there? So you see all these blessings, and then they say, let me see it. Halfway through verse 15, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. So this daughter-in-law who loves you, these blessings are because of what Ruth has done. I mean, ultimately, of course, they've already acknowledged the Lord's work in this, but now they're pointing to Ruth, whom the Lord used. For this daughter-in-law who loves you more than who loves you. And it is interesting that they revived this familial term even after Ruth's married to Boaz. So technically, Ruth is not Naomi's daughter-in-law anymore, right? Whoever Boaz's mother was, well, we know who she was. It was Rahab, right? Now Ruth would be her daughter-in-law, but they revived this familial term for Ruth with Naomi, and it is interesting, even after she marries Boaz. The commentators think this is because this relationship that they have was stronger than any human bond. This relationship that they had together, that they had forged with one another because of hesed love for one another, was stronger than any human bond. And we can see that, right? Like the relationships that we form in the Lord are often stronger and more binding even than our biological ones. So Naomi and Ruth weren't biologically related, and when Ruth married Boaz, they were no longer even related by marriage. And yet we see that this bond that was formed for them by the Lord was actually stronger than any human bond. And we see that in our own lives. And in fact, we see this in Jesus's life too, don't we? So in Matthew 12:46 through 50, we read this. While he, Jesus, was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hands towards his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So we see that there actually is something thicker than blood. When the old saying, blood is thicker than water, is actually not true if we're talking about the water of the Spirit, right? So there is a water that's thicker than blood. And so our relationships with one another as brothers and sisters in Christ often become more binding and stronger and deeper than even our biological relations. The final accolade on Ruth from the women, then a final accolade on Ruth from the women of town, possibly the very women who had ignored her when she arrived in Bethlehem with Naomi. So she is better to Naomi than 7 sons. 7 sons was the Israelite ideal, perfect number of sons, or perfect number for sons. And Ruth was even better than that. So Ruth, who was ignored and potentially mistreated by Naomi in some ways, now receives this accolade of being better than 7 sons. So in this culture too, we would see a preference for sons. And yet because of this kind of daughter-in-law, this daughter that Ruth was, she became better to Naomi than even 7 sons would have been. Okay, so we see Naomi taking the child onto her lap and becoming his nurse. Nurse is not a clear, really a clear word to translate this. It doesn't really describe what's going on today. She, in effect, became his nanny, but not in the sense of the word that we use today. It's stronger, almost like a foster mother type of relationship, though not in a legal sense. I thought it would be helpful to read a comment from Robert Hubbard in his commentary about this relationship. He says, this statement is significant in two respects. First, it anticipates the mother-son relationship about to be declared in verse 17a. In fact, the absence of the child's natural parents from the scene suggests a relational distance between them and the boy. As stated above, Naomi was to have an ongoing relationship with him. Second, like similar cases of lamentation found in Scripture, it resolves Naomi's outcry through her acceptance of her new role. Instead of an explanation for her tragic suffering, she received a renewed vocation. I'm going to read that again. Instead of an explanation for her tragic suffering, she received a new vocation, the vocation of nurse or foster mother to Obed. Back to the quote, assured by her experience of God's faithful presence, she gladly accepted the care of the one who in turn would later care for her. Thus she exemplifies a believer who surrenders unanswered, bitter questions, embraces the certainty of God's blessed presence, and seizes present opportunities for his glory. Okay, we're going to walk this out a little bit because honestly, in my opinion, this is one of the most important things that we need to learn from the book of Ruth. What is Robert Hubbard saying here about this acceptance by Naomi of this child to be his nurse or to be his foster mother? What is he saying about that? Well, what he's saying is that she, instead of receiving an answer for all her suffering and all her misery, instead she receives a different or a new vocation. Right? So she doesn't get an answer for why she suffered the way she does, but what she gets is a new vocation or a new, we might say, lease on life, right? With the arrival of Obed. And I think this is a good word for us all, isn't it? I found it a really good word for me this morning, a good reminder that I needed. We will not, ladies, get an explanation for all of our suffering. We simply will not. We won't. If we're waiting for that, we're waiting for something that's never going to happen. We will not get a full explanation for why the suffering that has happened in our life suffered. Naomi didn't, Ruth didn't. They got partial, right? They got a partial explanation. In the marriage to Boaz for Ruth and the coming of Obed, we see a partial revelation, but it's doubtful that they lived long enough. I mean, maybe Ruth, I don't know, to see King David. I don't know how many generations. Sometimes the Bible skips generations in the genealogies. So they didn't get an answer for their suffering, why it happened. They certainly had no idea that from them the Christ would come, that through their line, that the Lord would send his son. So then the question for us becomes, what will we choose? So we don't get an answer. We don't get an answer for the suffering. So the question comes for us, which path will we go down? Will we choose a path of bitterness, demanding answers for God for all of our suffering? Or will we choose a path of embracing God's presence, as Hubbard says, and seizing his glory with whatever opportunities are afforded to us? So we started this study by quoting Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. And I'm going to read it for us again. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So I want to suggest that the road most taken is the road of bitterness because of our circumstances. I think the road most taken is the road of bitterness because of our circumstances. And I think that's across the board. I think in society, that's what we see. I think that's even in the church, a lot of times what we see. I know in my own life, I've been on that road. I've chosen the road of bitterness rather than the road that is less taken, of embracing what God has for us and doing what He has given us to do with all of our might. I have taken the bitter road. And so I think that is the road most taken for us. But when faced with a choice to choose the bitter road or the road embracing what God has for us, the less taken road, I want to just encourage us afresh to take that road. Take the road less taken. Embrace what God has given to you with all the heartaches and all the difficulties and all the questions. Embrace that road. Don't take the bitter road. I love what John Piper says. Occasionally weep deeply over the life you had hoped for. Grieve the losses, then wash your face, trust God, and embrace the life you have. I love that. I think it's exactly what we're seeing here, what we're seeing Naomi do. Gloriously, the Lord allows us to change course mid-path. So this is the glorious thing, right? So did the Lord wait for Naomi to choose the not bitter path to start providing for her, making a way for her? No, the Lord had a plan, and He was providing for her and making a way for her even while she was bitter, even while she was still not trusting Him, even while she was still seeing Him as harsh. He was still providing for her and making a way for her. And this is what, even if we're choosing the bitter path this morning, you can change today. God's mercies for you, because of the gospel, God's mercies for you are new every morning. So even if in your current hard circumstance, and we've all got them, everyone that I'm seeing on this screen, we all have our hard circumstances, right? Even if up till this morning we've been choosing the bitter path, we can change course because of the gospel and the new mercies this morning, and embrace the life that God has given us, and use and take hold of the opportunities that He has given us for His glory. There are 1,000 do-overs with the Lord. There's not just one do-over with the Lord. There are 1,000 do-overs for the Lord's children. And there's a never-ending storehouse of new morning mercies for us. Okay, so back to the story. The women named the baby Obed, which again is so odd. Not Naomi, not Ruth, not Boaz. The women of the town, they named the child, but no explanation. So it must have been common in that day for townspeople to name your child. I don't know. It's very strange to me. Obed means one who works or one who serves, which I love. I don't know if anyone's going to want to name their kid Obed. It's a little, I don't know if it doesn't really roll off our tongue today, but it is a great name for him, isn't it? Considering what he would go on to do in the life of Naomi. Suddenly, the narrator reveals a startling new dimension about the story, right? It isn't just about two struggling widows and the way that the Lord would care for them. It's about the king, right? It's about King David and Obed being his grandfather. So we see this moving into verses 18 through 22. There's the genealogy of Perez. This section of the book's third, so there are three endings in the book. This is the third and final ending, and like other genealogy, it probably has gaps in it. We're not sure, but there are probably gaps in this genealogy. Boaz appears as the seventh ancestor. Again, 7 is a place of honor, so 7 sons, and now in this genealogy, Boaz appears as the 7th ancestor, as a place of honor and importance. And it gives the genealogy, as genealogies are supposed to do, it gives us a chance to reflect on God's providential purposes. So while they include me, His providential purposes are not about me. So I don't know if you knew that or not, but God's providential purposes, they include you, but they're not about you. They're not about me, right? They're about him and his glory. So these providential purposes were not centered on Ruth or Naomi or Boaz or even Obed. His providential purposes are centered on the coming of a king, first King David, and then later the King of Kings, Jesus. And God is always simultaneously doing several things in several lives. This is what I think is so amazing, and probably something we'll spend a great part of eternity finding out about, is how God is working simultaneously and contemporaneously in so many people's lives. God is at work in our lives, but our lives affect other people's lives, right? And so somehow God is working all things together for his people's good, and all things according to his great purposes. It is mind-boggling to stop and think about it. And this is something that a genealogy gives us a chance to sort of pause and contemplate. God is working to bring a king, but he's also working to provide for a couple of widows, and he's also working for Boaz to give him a wife. So there's a lot going on here. He's working in the time that the judges ruled to bring forth a king, right? So when Obed was born, there was no king. There were judges, right? And so it's only later on that the people of Israel even had a king, and King David would come from this line. So there are interim and final consumptions to God's purpose. Obed resolved the interim issue in Ruth and Naomi's life, but he also fathered King David and finally King Jesus. So the book ends with the repetition that King David was a descendant of Obed, and that would have been glorious, but how much more glorious for us, right? I want to close our time by reading a quote from Sinclair Ferguson. He has sadly, at one time I had this book. It's called Faithful God by Sinclair Ferguson, and it's based on the book of Ruth. It's a commentary on the book of Ruth. I cannot find it. But I did, thankfully, in my notes, find this quote that I had typed out, and so I want to read it to us. This, then, is the final explanation for and the purpose behind the trauma of Naomi's experience and the costly pilgrimage of Ruth. What God was quarrying out of the suffering of these two women was nothing less than his purpose to bring his son into the world in Bethlehem. He had in view not only providing literal bread in Bethlehem for a Gentile woman and her Jewish mother-in-law, but the coming of the bread of life, broken not only for Israel, but in order to provide salvation for men and women in every place. And so then just to close with a question for reflection, I sent you some other questions, but this is a question for you and for me, really. What part is your suffering playing in God's redemption story? Now, clearly, the Redeemer has already come, but there are millions of sons and daughters that are yet to be brung into the family. And what part is your suffering playing in God's redemption story? Some you'll know, some things you will know here on earth. God will be kind to reveal some of these things. But there are many, many things that we won't know till glory. Okay, that's all I have for today. I did send you